In the shadowed heart of 1840s Manchester, England, the city pulsed with the relentless rhythm of industry. Textile factories towered over narrow, soot-stained streets, their chimneys spewing black smoke that choked the sky and settled like ash on the skin of those below. The air was thick with the stench of coal and damp wool, and the clatter of looms echoed through the city like a ceaseless heartbeat. Among the thousands drawn to Manchester's mills was Sarah Dunn, a 19-year-old with a frame slight from hunger and hands scarred by the bite of cotton threads. Her dark hair was pinned tightly beneath a faded cap, and her gray eyes held a quiet fire that the factory's grime could not extinguish. Sarah had come to the city 2 years prior, fleeing a failing farm in Lancashire after her parents succumbed to fever, leaving her alone to fend for herself. She shared a damp tenement room with 5 other girls, their mattresses straw-filled and crawling with lice, their nights haunted by the coughs of those too broken to work another day. Each morning, as the factory bell tolled at dawn, Sarah joined the stream of workers trudging through muddy alleys, their faces pale, their bodies bent under the weight of endless labor. The factory where Sarah worked was a cavernous beast, its brick walls slick with condensation, its air heavy with the heat of machinery and the sour tang of sweat. Inside, the looms roared, their iron frames shuddering as they spun cotton into cloth, each clank a reminder of the city's unyielding demands. Sarah's job was to tend the threads, her fingers darting to tie broken strands before the overseer noticed, her arms aching from the constant motion. She worked 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, her wages a meager 2 shillings, barely enough for a loaf of bread and a scrap of cheese. The factory owner, Mr. Edward Langley, was a man of wealth and influence, his name whispered with fear by the workers who toiled for him. Langley rarely visited the mill, but his presence was felt through the overseer, Mr. Brant, a hulking figure with a face pocked by smallpox and eyes that gleamed with malice. Brant prowled the factory floor, his leather whip coiled at his side, his voice a snarl as he barked orders at the girls. He took a particular interest in Sarah, his gaze lingering too long, his hand brushing against her shoulder as he passed, his threats veiled but clear. Sarah learned to keep her head down, her movements quick, but the weight of his attention pressed against her like a storm waiting to break. The workers in the factory were a mix of women and children, their lives bound by the same desperation that had driven Sarah to Manchester. Some were as young as 9, their small hands nimble, but their bodies frail, their eyes hollow from hunger and exhaustion. Sarah befriended a girl named Mary, a 15-year-old with a cough that rattled her thin frame, and Hannah, a woman in her 30s whose hands shook from years at the looms. They shared whispered stories during stolen moments, their voices low to avoid Brant's wrath. Mary spoke of her dream to see the sea, while Hannah mourned a child lost to fever in the tenements. Sarah held their hands in the dark, her own dreams buried beneath the reality of survival. She thought often of her parents, of the farm where she'd once run through fields of wildflowers, but those memories felt like a different life, one the factory had stolen from her. Each day blurred into the next, the noise of the looms drowning out hope, the heat sapping her strength until a single moment changed everything. One evening, as the factory bell signaled the end of a grueling shift, Sarah lingered to fetch a bucket of water to clean her station. The other workers had shuffled out, their footsteps fading into the hum of the city, leaving the factory eerily quiet. As she passed Brant's office, a small room tucked behind the main floor, she noticed the door ajar, a faint light flickering within. Curiosity, or perhaps a flicker of defiance, drew her closer. Through the crack, she saw Brant's desk, cluttered with papers and an empty whiskey bottle. But what caught her eye was a small drawer left unlocked, its key glinting in the candlelight. Sarah's heart pounded as she slipped inside, her hands trembling as she opened the drawer. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with cramped handwriting, numbers, and names she didn't recognize. As she scanned the entries, her breath caught. There were records of stolen wages, children worked beyond legal hours, and bribes paid to inspectors to ignore the factory's violations. Mr. Langley's signature marked several pages, his greed laid bare in ink. Sarah understood the power of what she held. This ledger could ruin Langley, but it could also destroy her if she were caught. She tore a scrap of cloth from her apron, her fingers fumbling for a pencil stub she'd once found on the factory floor. In the dim light, she copied the most damning entries, her handwriting shaky but legible, her ears straining for any sign of Brant's return. The ledger detailed payments to silence grieving families, children injured by the looms, their lives valued at a few shillings. Sarah's anger burned brighter with each word, her resolve hardening. She tucked the cloth into her bodice, its rough edges scratching against her skin, and returned the ledger to the drawer, locking it as she'd found it. Slipping out of the office, she moved through the factory like a shadow, her mind racing with possibilities. She couldn't confront Langley directly. He'd crush her without a thought. But there were rumors of a journalist in Manchester, a man named Mr. Ellis, who wrote for a reformist paper and exposed corruption among the city's elite. If she could get the evidence to him, Langley's empire might crumble. Over the next few days, Sarah whispered her plan to Mary and Hannah, their faces pale, but their eyes alight with a flicker of hope. They met in the factory yard at dusk, the air thick with fog, their voices barely audible over the hum of the city. Mary's hands shook as she agreed to keep watch, while Hannah, her cough worsening, vowed to spread word among the other workers. Sarah knew the risks. If Brant or Langley discovered her, she'd be dismissed, or worse, sent to the workhouse where survival was a daily gamble. But the thought of the children, of Mary's fading strength, and the countless others broken by the factory fueled her courage. She began to watch for opportunities, noting the comings and goings of delivery boys and the rare visitors to the factory. One morning, as a cart arrived with coal, Sarah spotted Mr. Ellis among the crowd, his coat patched, but his posture proud, a notebook tucked under his arm. She slipped the cloth from her bodice, her heart pounding, and approached him as he spoke with the driver. Her voice was low, her words rushed, as she pressed the cloth into his hands, begging him to read it, to tell the world what Langley had done. Ellis's eyes widened, but he nodded, tucking the cloth into his coat, before disappearing into the fog. The following days were a torment of waiting. Sarah moved through her tasks with a mask of calm, her hands steady as she worked the looms, but her mind raced with fear. Brant seemed more watchful, his temper shorter, as if he sensed a shift. One evening he cornered Sarah by the water pump, his breath sour as he accused her of slacking, his hand gripping her arm until it bruised. She pulled away, her defiance flaring, but she kept silent, knowing her time would come. On the 5th day after meeting Ellis, a hush fell over the factory as the morning bell rang. A crowd gathered outside the gates, workers murmuring as a printed broadsheet passed from hand to hand. Ellis's article had been published, its headline bold, "The Shame of Manchester's Mills." It detailed Langley's crimes, the stolen wages, the children's suffering, and the bribes, all traced back to the ledger Sarah had uncovered. The workers' anger simmered, their voices rising as they refused to start the looms, their silence a rebellion louder than the machines. Brant stormed through the factory, his whip cracking, but the tide had turned. Langley arrived that afternoon, his face pale, his voice sharp as he dismissed the claims, but the damage was done. Inspectors descended on the factory, their faces grim, and Langley's name became a stain on Manchester's history. Sarah and several others were dismissed, their names blackened, but as she walked away from the factory, the city's smoky skyline at her back, she felt a weight lift. She found work in a smaller mill, its conditions no better, but her spirit remained unbroken. In the 1840s, factory reforms were still years away. The cries of workers like Sarah, a whisper against the roar of industry. Yet her rebellion, small as it was, planted a seed, a spark of defiance that would one day ignite change